So we have 15 minutes. I promise we will finish on time. We just to have an idea, who would be interested in posing a question? Can I see some? Okay. So let's proceed then one by one. Please introduce yourself, your name and your institution before posing the question.
Durham from Virginia University. This is a question for Cecile Laborde. One of your tests for integrity was that it not take abhorrent views. Where do you see the borderline of abhorrence? Because, I mean, obviously the cases you gave are very clear, but the hard cases are likely to be kinds of discrimination that people object to. So how do you deal with that?
Thanks, Cole. That's obviously a crucial question. I didn't have time to say much about it. So I want to allow quite a large scope for reasonable disagreement about what counts as abhorrent. So the theory will be quite permissive about quite a number of controversial claims made by religious groups, particularly in case of discrimination. So in other words, they would probably pass the first stage on my test, and all the interesting discussions then would happen at the second stage, whether they should go ahead given the rights of others. What I wanted to exclude from the first prong of the test is quite a narrow set of claims that by any definition there cannot be reasonable disagreement about. So what I have in mind is something like a core of central basic human rights, that commitment to define what we take to be a kind of universal moral community, so widely shared across the world. That's why I took my example carefully to signal that it would be quite a narrow set that wouldn't make the first stage. So all the interesting discussion will happen then at second stage, in the case of all the other claims of which you were speaking about.
Thank you. Thank you. Abadir Ibrahim, I am from Ethiopia. I'm also hailing from St. Thomas University in Miami. I'll address my question to the last speaker. I had a hard time understanding why you feel that the freedom of religion is unintelligible without a Protestant ethic, because I'm someone who comes from a legal tradition in which we have the freedom of a secular legal tradition where we have and do practice the freedom of religion, and within the different cultures, both academic and popular culture in Ethiopia, we believe we have understood and we think that the freedom of religion is intelligible to us. And I'm wondering if you have a particular understanding, a particular very academic understanding of the freedom of, or very historical understanding of the freedom of religion, and maybe that's the hindrance that's allowing you to say not to recognize that others can see the freedom of religion as something intelligible.
Yeah, so you look at the freedom of religion as a secular idea, basically. I think you said. I mean, my argument basically depends on this. You see, I'm not simply claiming that it's not a roots argument. I'm not saying just because the idea of religion freedom somehow derives from, can be traceable to, has its origins in Protestant theology. It's not an argument which is based on origins. It's not an argument either which is based on influence. Right? I'm not saying that contemporary ideas of religious freedom have been influenced by Protestant theology. Of course they have. And of course the first point about origin, of course they do derive from, in a genealogical sense, they do derive from Protestant theology. I think not many people will argue about that, right? Even David Hume might not. I don't think you will argue about that. But my point is stronger than that. What I'm saying is that there is a relationship of dependence between ideas of religious freedom and Protestant theology, and more widely Christian theology. So, of course, it's easy for me to claim, I could be in India or Japan or whatever, right? And say, oh yeah, this makes sense to me as well. We have religions. Arif said that. He lives in a region where there's a multiplicity of religions, right? What makes them religions, I'm not really even sure. Maybe in Ethiopia, it's more credible to claim that you do have a multiplicity of religions, right? At least Christianity, Islam, right? Which I would say are religions in a proper sense. But I think more than simply asserting that it is intelligible to you, I would like to see evidence of how, let's say, these international guarantees on religious freedom and so on, how they are made sense of by your legislators, by your judges. And do they betray do they act as if, or do they talk as if they have access to the kind of cluster of concepts which gives life to religious freedom? Because that cluster of concepts is dependent on Christian theology, and Protestant theology specifically. So I hope that helps to somehow clarify the argument that I'm trying to make.
Eileen Barker, London School of Economics. No, in answer to your last thing, I'm with our friend from Ethiopia. I don't understand. I think in Japan, for example, they have got grasp of the concepts. If you look at the trials when the Shinrikyo incident occurred, they were drawing very much on ideas of freedom of religion, bending over backwards, to be fair to Ashihara. Sorry? Sorry? Oh. Can you hear me now? I'll stand up because I've got a loud voice. I'm still wanting further elaboration. You mentioned Japan, and I would have thought in Japan, when I've read some of the trials that have gone on there has been a very strong awareness of the concept of freedom of religion in certain cases. And I'd like some more examples of where those concepts don't exist. And I'm sure they don't exist in some places, but I do think that they exist in quite a number of places. Even, funnily enough, in somewhere like China, they may not follow everything, but they understand the concepts. At least some of them do. I don't see why you think it is so dependent upon Protestant ethic.
Yeah, the word Protestant ethic has been mentioned twice.
Sorry.
I didn't mean to make a reference to Max Weber, like I did, but you see, I would hope that people try to recall the last line of my presentation, which is that the onus is on those people who claim that people from a different culture, from a non-Western culture, have access to these ideas, actually do have access to these ideas. That's what I would like to be interested in. So if you say to me that, oh, Japanese judges merely recite the idea of freedom of religion. In fact, I've written an article on Japan and India comparing them. And I showed that actually the way in which Japanese judges use religious freedom would make no sense to a judge in the United States, for instance, or to a British judge, right? And by using religious freedom in the way they do, they betray that actually these ideas are not intelligible to them. Just going back a few decades, when you look at the proceedings of the Constituent Assembly of Japan, which, you know, the assembly which decided on the shape of the Japanese constitution, which was of course actually very strongly influenced by the US, because the US was actually at the time occupying Japan, and insisted on the insertion of the idea of freedom of religion, which is almost a carbon copy of the First Amendment. Members of the Constituent Assembly were talking basically gobbledygook in relation to their, you know, when they were discussing the idea of religious freedom. So again, what I'm saying, I must insist on this point that, you see, unless you say that ideas which are nurtured and are dependent on conceptual frameworks which exist in one culture can easily travel, which I don't think they can, right? Can easily travel just like Coca-Cola or McDonald's can travel. Then the onus is on you to satisfy others, to say, well, to explain how it is that those ideas travel and are intelligible. Right? I hope that's okay.
Thank you very much. My name is Sophie van Bijsterveld, and I'm from the Netherlands. I just would like to continue the further conversation. Do I understand it correctly that you say that in the West, in the Protestant background, freedom of religion has been invented, and there is the right way that we interpret freedom of religion, and that we measure other cultures that say that they have freedom of religion, we measure to see if they really understood it well, if they're up to the mark to the way we understand it. And that they have the onus to prove that they have a real understanding of freedom of religion. I would find that a rather remarkable way of legal argument. Sort of essentialistic article that we say we have the real thing and the others say that they have, but they will still have to prove to us that they have really understood it.
Yeah. See, both Western people and non-Western people get upset when I argue like this, right? Because you see, within the West, of course, there's this impulse of universalization, right? Which comes from Christianity, actually. You see, this idea of secularization that I was talking about is not just restricted to the Western world, because Christianity, by secularizing itself, spreads throughout the world. And human rights is an agency for doing that, right? It's an instrument for doing that, right? So the ground assumption or intuition within Western culture is that these ideas must be universal. I'm saying, and I think I've laid down a number of steps which show that actually if you want to argue like that, the onus is on you to prove that other people in the world actually get what you're saying, that they have intuitive access to the way in which Westerners have intuitive access to these ideas. I'm not saying that all Westerners interpret the religious freedom in the same way. It's obvious from David Little's discussion, right, and your rendition of the arguments made by Winifred Sullivan that in the United States people have massive controversies about the scope of religious freedom. That's obvious. So do we in Europe, right? That doesn't mean that there are a certain number of background assumptions that are either presupposed or explicitly referred to when ideas of religious freedom are discussed. These ideas are simply absent in other cultures of the world. So please show me how they are present. Please show me.
We have time for one more question.
Javier, can I just sort of change? Is that right?
Yes.
Yes, I just, let me just assert myself in to add to the discussion. I'm glad we have Prakash here because, as Arif pointed out to me, we three were more or less perhaps preaching to the choir, and poor Prakash gets the brunt of the criticisms. My only response would be, but if you change the context, for example, to my suggestion that the language involved in the human rights corpus is got to be seen against the state versus conscience background. And that predicament seems to me to characterize countries around the world under the basically nation-state problem. If you change the context to include the nation-state situation in which governments are in a variety of ways imposing on the consciences of their citizens, then it's not just a matter of inherited culture, either in the West or in the non-West, but it's a function in part. I'm not excluding by any means the cultural background. I do think that's pertinent, and if you can show that certain Japanese judges render decisions that are incomprehensible to the Westerner, that's interesting and needs to be looked at. So that's the evidence that you would need to bring forward. But it seems to me the context in question is more complicated than just the cultural background. It's the nation-state context in which states are modernized to a greater or lesser degree, capable of using the apparatus of repression and oppressions, police forces, surveillance techniques, a variety of methods, which introduces a new element in respect to this question of freedom of religion, namely the state's interest versus the citizens' interests as they see it. Wouldn't you agree with that? That complexifies, at least, the questions at issue. It's not just the cultural background. Does that make sense, or?
I don't know, it's intelligible to me. But look, let's not appeal to complexity, right? Because for every scientific problem, you can always say it's too complicated, we can't solve it, right? So the way science proceeds is to narrow down the research problem, right? To say, I'm addressing this part of the problem. So that's what I'm trying to do. I'm not trying to answer every possible eventuality or contingency which might affect the way in which we evaluate this problem. But you referred to conscience. Now, what is conscience in a culture like India or China? It's a rhetorical question in a way, but it's also it's a serious question as well.
We don't have any more time for questions. It has become a little late, and I promise that we will finish on time. So we can continue our discussion during the coffee break and any other time during these 2 days. Thanks to everybody for being here. Let's express our appreciation to the panel.